To Dehradun, India, 2,234 feet. Far from the mountains in winter, I discovered the blurred photo of Everest in Richard Halliburton's Book of Marvels. It was a miserable reproduction in which the jagged peaks rose white against a grotesquely blackened and scratched sky. Everest itself, sitting back from the front ones, didn't even appear highest, but it didn't matter. It was. The legend said so. Dreams were the key to the picture, permitting a boy to enter it, to stand at the crest of the windswept ridge, to climb toward the summit, now no longer far above. This was one of those uninhibited dreams that come free with growing up. I was sure that mine about Everest was not mine alone. The highest point on Earth, unattainable, foreign to all experience, was there for many boys and grown men to aspire toward. Thomas F. Hornbein, Everest, the West Ridge. The actual particulars of the event are unclear, obscured by the accretion of myth. But the year was 1852, and the setting was the offices of the Great Trigonometrical Survey of India in the northern hill station of Dehradun. According to the most plausible version of what transpired, a clerk rushed into the chambers of Sir Andrew Waugh, India's Surveyor General, and exclaimed that a Bengali computer named Radhanath Sikdar, working out of the survey's Calcutta Bureau, had discovered the highest mountain in the world. In Waugh's day, a computer was a job description rather than a machine. Designated Peak 15 by surveyors in the field, who'd first measured the angle of its rise with a 24-inch theodolite 3 years earlier, the mountain in question jutted from the spine of the Himalaya in the forbidden kingdom of Nepal. Until Sikdar compiled the survey data and did the math, nobody had suspected that there was anything noteworthy about Peak 15. The 6 survey sites from which the summit had been triangulated were in northern India, more than 100 miles from the mountain. To the surveyors who shot it, all but the summit nub of Peak 15 was obscured by various high escarpments in the foreground, several of which gave the illusion of being much greater in stature. But according to Sikdar's meticulous trigonometric reckoning, which took into account such factors as curvature of the Earth, atmospheric refraction, and plumb line deflection, Peak 15 stood 29,002 feet above sea level, the planet's loftiest point. In 1865, 9 years after Sikdar's computations had been confirmed, Waugh bestowed the name Mount Everest on Peak 15 in honor of Sir George Everest, his predecessor as Surveyor General. As it happened, Tibetans who lived to the north of the great mountain already had a more mellifluous name for it, Jomolungma, which translates to Goddess, Mother of the World, and Nepalese who resided to the south reportedly called the Peak Devadunga, Seat of God. But Waugh pointedly chose to ignore these native appellations, as well as official policy encouraging the retention of local or ancient names, and Everest was the name that stuck. Once Everest was determined to be the highest summit on Earth, it was only a matter of time before people decided that Everest needed to be climbed. After the American explorer Robert Peary claimed to have reached the North Pole in 1909, and Roald Amundsen led a Norwegian party to the South Pole in 1911, Everest, the so-called Third Pole, became the most coveted object in the realm of terrestrial exploration. Getting to the top, proclaimed Gunther O. Dyrenforth, an influential alpinist and chronicler of early Himalayan mountaineering, was a matter of universal human endeavor, a cause from which there is no withdrawal, whatever losses it may demand. Those losses, as it turned out, would not be insignificant. Following Sikdar's discovery in 1852, it would require the lives of 24 men, the efforts of 15 expeditions, and the passage of 101 years before the summit of Everest would finally be attained. Among mountaineers and other connoisseurs of geologic form, Everest is not regarded as a particularly comely peak. Its proportions are too chunky, too broad of beam, too crudely hewn. But what Everest lacks in architectural grace, it makes up for with sheer, overwhelming mass. Demarcating the Nepal-Tibet border, towering more than 12,000 feet above the valleys at its base, Everest looms as a three-sided pyramid of gleaming ice and dark, striated rock. The first 8 expeditions to Everest were British, all of which attempted the mountain from the northern Tibetan side. Not so much because it presented the most obvious weakness in the peak's formidable defenses, but rather because in 1921, The Tibetan government opened its long-closed borders to foreigners, while Nepal remained resolutely off-limits. The first Everesters were obliged to trek 400 arduous miles from Darjeeling across the Tibetan plateau, simply to reach the foot of the mountain. Their knowledge of the deadly effects of extreme altitude was scant, and their equipment was pathetically inadequate by modern standards. Yet in 1924, a member of the Third British Expedition, Edward Felix Norton, reached an elevation of 28,126 feet, just 900 feet below the summit, before being defeated by exhaustion and snow blindness. It was an astounding achievement that was probably not surpassed for 28 years. I say probably because of what transpired 4 days after Norton's summit assault. At first light on June 8th, two other members of the 1924 British team, George Lee Mallory and Andrew Irvine, departed the highest camp for the top. Mallory, whose name is inextricably linked to Everest, was the driving force behind the first 3 expeditions to the peak. While on a lantern slide lecture tour of the United States, it was he who so notoriously quipped, "Because it is there," when an irritating newspaperman demanded to know why he wanted to climb Everest. In 1924, Mallory was 38, a married schoolmaster with 3 young children. A product of upper-tier English society, he was also an aesthete and idealist with decidedly romantic sensibilities. His athletic grace, social charm, and striking physical beauty had made him a favorite of Lytton Strachey and the Bloomsbury crowd. While tent-bound high on Everest, Mallory and his companions would read aloud to one another from Hamlet and King Lear. As Mallory and Irvine struggled slowly toward the summit of Everest on June 8, 1924, mist billowed across the upper pyramid, preventing companions lower on the mountain from monitoring the 2 climbers' progress. At 12:50 p.m., the clouds parted momentarily, and teammate Noel Odell caught a brief but clear glimpse of Mallory and Irvine high on the peak, approximately 5 hours behind schedule, but moving deliberately and expeditiously toward the top. The 2 climbers failed to return to their tent that night, however, and neither Mallory nor Irvine was ever seen again. Whether one or both of them reached the summit before being swallowed by the mountain and into legend has been fiercely debated ever since. In 1999, the well-known American climber Conrad Anker discovered Mallory's body on a sloping ledge at 27,000 feet, where it had come to rest after an apparent fall 75 years earlier. Several intriguing artifacts were found with Mallory's remains, but Anker's astonishing discovery raised more questions than it answered. The balance of the evidence strongly suggested that Mallory and Irvine did not reach the top before they perished. In 1949, after centuries of inaccessibility, Nepal opened its borders to the outside world, and a year later the new communist regime in China closed Tibet to foreigners. Those who would climb Everest therefore shifted their attention to the south side of the peak. In the spring of 1953, a large British team, organized with the righteous zeal and overpowering resources of a military campaign, became the 3rd expedition to attempt Everest from Nepal. On May 28th, following 2.5 months of prodigious effort, a high camp was dug tenuously into the southeast ridge at 27,900 feet. Early the following morning, Edmund Hillary, a rangy New Zealander, and Tenzing Norgay, a highly skilled Sherpa mountaineer, set out for the top, breathing bottled oxygen. By 9 a.m., they were at the south summit, gazing across the dizzyingly narrow ridge that led to the summit proper. Another hour brought them to the foot of what Hillary described as the most formidable-looking problem on the ridge, a rock step some 40 feet high. The rock itself, smooth and almost holdless, might have been an interesting Sunday afternoon problem to a group of expert climbers in the Lake District. But here it was, a barrier beyond our feeble strength to overcome. With Tenzing nervously paying out rope from below, Hillary wedged himself into a cleft between the rock buttress and a fin of vertical snow at its edge, then began to inch his way up what would thereafter be known as the Hillary Step. The climbing was strenuous and sketchy, but Hillary persisted until, as he would later write, "I could finally reach over the top of the rock and drag myself out of the crack onto a wide ledge. For a few moments I lay regaining my breath, and for the first time really felt the fierce determination that nothing now could stop us reaching the top. I took a firm stance on the ledge and signaled to Tenzing to come on up. As I heaved hard on the rope, Tenzing wriggled his way up the crack and finally collapsed exhausted at the top like a giant fish when it has just been hauled from the sea after a terrible struggle.